All right, so we should just get started. Hello, welcome. My name is Dr. Eileen Chanza Torres. I'm a faculty member at Westminster College, and I want to welcome you all to Rhetoric or Incitement, When Does Speech Cross the Line? So this conversation that we're going to have today started with a conversation between Dr. Kim Sarkin and I, where I desperately wanted and demanded answers from Dr. Sarkin about what happened on January 6th at the Capitol. And so we're joined by, of course, Dr. Kim Sarkin, the professor and chair of the communication program at Westminster College, Cami Mandu. Did I pronounce your name right? A student.
Close. It's Mondo, but close enough.
Sorry, communications and major in and a sociology minor. And she's also the editor-in-chief of the forum. We're also being joined by Leah Baez, political science and pre-law major, whose work focuses on human rights and international policy, and Ryan Leray, who is a Westminster alum, who received his BA in political science in 2018, is currently working for the Salt Lake Mayor's office and will be off to law school come August. And also Dr. Michael Sarkin, the professor of political science and chair of the Department of Politics and Justice Studies at Westminster. Help me welcome them to our virtual stage. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to hand it over to Ryan Leray, who will run the show.
Yes. Well, hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us. You know, when I'm thinking about the First Amendment, I have really two big thoughts in my mind right now, which is one, what does standing up for free speech right now look like when we're seeing free speech used to incite violence? And two, how does this moment that we're in, you know, post January 6th, what does this mean for US democracy, both the study of it and the history of US democracy? What does it mean for the state of our democracy? So with those two really meta, huge questions in mind, I'm going to ask Dr. Kim Sarkin, one, what are your thoughts about this? And I guess more so, what does this mean for our democracy?
Well, I'll leave the democracy question probably to the American government professor, but to kind of start, the thing to remember is that, you know, we view the First Amendment and you know, theorists who think about it have always put political speech at the center of protections, that the limits that come on speech come on things like commercial speech or, you know, art and entertainment, but that we've always had this philosophical perspective in this country that political speech needed absolute protection. And for example, so that's why we have laws about truth in advertising, but no laws related to truth in political advertising, because the idea is we wanted to give the most room. But the other thing that runs alongside this is the notion of incitement to violence is no longer considered speech. That's considered action, and that is considered outside the First Amendment. But we had this long journey in this country about what that actually looked like. And for many, many years, we were banning speech that from a 2021 perspective, we would think, that they were simply shutting down dissent, shutting down, communists or trade unionists or whatever. And we got to a place about 40 or 50 years ago where we had finally said, okay, it's got to be eminent lawless action. It has to be this immediate thing. But that predated all of our new technologies. And so what does incitement mean in the modern age is a really hard question. Because it used to be, I'm leading, I've got my pitchfork and my torch, and I'm literally leading a mob. Well, you don't need a pitchfork and a torch, and you don't need to be there anymore. And that's sort of where we're at, and then layer onto that the ideas we have about hate speech, how we define it, what we allow. Again, it had been long considered the norm in First Amendment that you just let hateful people talk and that diffuses the situation. Well, we knew starting with Charlottesville that that's not true, and it just escalated from there. And so we have the incitement layer, the free speech layer, and the hate speech layer that have created a world that's infinitely more complicated than First Amendment scholars had ever imagined. Mike, do you want to take the democracy question?
And remind me, the question was, what does this mean for our democracy?
That, and more broadly, I mean, positioning this moment within the study of our democracy, looking back to how we have treated hate speech, when I saw personally the folks going up on January 6th, I immediately in my mind went to the ACLU fighting for the right of Nazis in America to march in a predominantly Jewish town. That's just immediately where my mind went. So I'm curious about, like, what does this journey of hate speech look like? But more so, what does it mean for the state of our democracy?
Well, it's certainly not the first time in our history we have endured hate speech in large volume. It's certainly the first time, I think, that we've had anything like this in our modern history, where somebody has, used violence, rhetoric has fueled violence to try to overturn an election. It's not a good sign. I mean, it's, just to put a fine point on it, I think there's a tendency of some people to want to be optimistic, but, democracies work on norms more than they work on what's on paper. It's nice to have a constitution that puts things on paper, but if we don't agree on some basic things, like, when you lose an election, you accept it and you move on, and you try to win the next one by having, ideas and policies that appeal to people. If we can't accept that, we don't have much of a democracy. Every theory of democracy that I'm familiar with is premised on the idea that, people will exercise a certain amount of reason, to try to get what they want. And that should work because we have elections and we have things like that. We're getting to a point where we don't accept that. We don't really have much of a democracy. So the question, I think, is what happens moving forward? Do we break away from this, or does this become the norm? If so, we could be looking at the beginning of the end of our democracy, I fear. But if we can realize that, we need to approach how we, and I think really it's we as citizens, it has to start there, how we as citizens approach the issue of democracy, how we hold our elected officials accountable. If we can't do that, elected people are not going to, this is just a fact. I mean, I think the history of democracy is taught that they just don't have the magnanimity to say, hey, I'm gonna, take only the actions that are good for the community rather than what's in my short-term political interest. That has to come from us to hold them accountable. And if we don't do that, nothing's gonna change.
Yeah, excellent. And what I'm thinking about from that is, so looking future forward, one of the things that made me think of, and I would love to have either Cami or Leah chime in on this, because both of you are interested in this topic, I think academically from different backgrounds, but being future forward, being the youngest people on the panel, I think it's important to get your perspective on that. But one, in this moment, is truth itself discernible or knowable when we have these giant social media conglomerates that feed us algorithms that only let us usually see specific type of information? We aren't seeing the type of gatekeepers that we had with newspapers for information. Most people are seeing that feed that's already tailored for them. And I think those social media companies hold some responsibility for that. But more so, it's the big question: is truth knowable, and how do we define truth in an era when it seems like everyone's kind of settling on calling the former president's sedition the big lie. That's what we're calling it, that the election was somehow stolen by illegitimate means. This seems like everyone's agreed that we're calling it the big lie, when that is the belief of a large swath of the country, that the election was stolen. How do we define truth? And also, what is the role in us, on ourselves, but also on those companies?
Yeah,
and that is, like I said, okay.
Sorry. No, I was just gonna say, I love this question because it is true. Like, how do you define truth? Someone who's a journalist and works in the news, my job is to report the truth. And just for context for the audience as well, like, I work for KSL as well. I've been there for a year, starting my news career, at the beginning of 2020. And anyone who lived through 2020 knows that was a very strange year. But in some ways, when January 6th happened and everything happened at the Capitol, I almost kind of wasn't surprised. Part of me was like, I can't believe this is real life. But the other half of me was like, they think this is true. And so working in journalism, it has been weird for me, kind of like an existential crisis of like, what is truth? How do I report the truth? And to me, it's something that it's universal, it's observable, and it can be verified through evidence and fact rather than just something that helps perpetuate a narrative or helps make you feel comfortable in the world that you're living in. And so the months leading up to the election and the January 6th riot at the Capitol, you saw a lot of different alternate realities on the internet. It was very difficult for me to cope with. I would do my job throughout the week reporting on things that were happening, and then walk outside to my friends or people I'm friends with on Facebook who genuinely didn't believe the things that I was writing. They thought that I was part of the lie or the media, things they're trying to make you believe and stuff. So it was very strange, but in a way, it's like, I think people are starting to blur the lines between what is truth and what their beliefs are. And with the internet, it makes it so much easier to ignore what's actually true and just put yourself in like these echo chambers where you only get to see the things that you believe in. And with algorithms, that also happens because they know what you're clicking on and they want you to keep clicking. So they'll only keep feeding you the information that you want to see. And it's become easier and easier for people to not fact check the links that they're clicking. They see a meme and they say, oh, this makes this person look really bad and I don't like that person, so I'm going to share it. That gets shared like 10 times over. And so it's just very easy that the truth is becoming something that I think is still possible to report on and find. It's just something that's not convenient anymore. And so people don't want to find it.
Yeah, excellent. And what that made me think about is what you said earlier, Kim, about what hate speech used to being is like that incitement bit, right? Like you're clearly inciting somebody to go do a crime immediately. And reflecting on the president's speech, one, I would love to hear everyone's thoughts about this, but do we think that the president was inciting hate speech, inciting violence, which I think personally, obviously, but also, is that the standard that we need going forward in a technology age? And also on that, what does that standard look like nowadays? Think about what Cami said with how easy it is to somehow share this misleading information, to share this hate speech. What does that look like in a modern age?
As somebody who has spent a career studying the First Amendment, I do think that when you take the sum total of what President Trump said between really, we're talking about late summer, because he was predicting the election would be stolen long before the election happened, arguably for maybe as long as a couple of years, or even his entire presidency, if we take into consideration how frequently he said the 2016 election was a problem because he didn't really lose the popular vote. But that's the thing, is our current jurisprudence says incitements about one day, one speech, one act. And that's just simply not what happened. We have, arguably 4 years, 4 months to 4 years, depending on how you frame it, of this constant repetition. You have the lack of trust of the media, which, and a fundamental lack of media literacy. And, and this goes back to the beginnings of partisan radio in the United States in the 80s, through the evolution of Fox News. And now, whether it's InfoWars or Newsmax or OANN or whatever, it is so easy to reinforce and reinforce and reinforce. And the fact of the matter is that when we look at, again, the conservative media, although I hesitate even to use the word conservative because I don't even know what that means anymore, but the more right-wing media, they also traffic in a lot of fear. And that is, I think, a critical part of the conversation, because I genuinely think there are people in this country who believe that somebody's coming to get them, and it changes. It might be, in the 80s when I was our students' age, it was all about, the feminists are coming to take everything away from you. And then, and it's the immigrants, and it's this and it's that. And so they're marinating in fear in a way that I believe is unprecedented in modern history. So how much kindling did Trump throw on the fire? And did he light the match? And would it have lit if he had not said anything prior? No, because if you look at the traditional definition of incitement, he has wiggle room for January 6th. But he had been running a hairdryer, to use a metaphor, over that kindling for at least 4 months. And all it took was a spark. But we don't have the legal mechanisms to deal with this, because this is not what the law says. And that's the key, is it going, you mentioned the large social media companies and the issue of deplatforming and things. It could be that, as much as I don't like the control that a lot of these companies have, they might be our only hope, because we don't have the legal mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was thinking about that the entire time while you're speaking, because when it comes to because when you mentioned OWN, which I think is how they pronounce their acronym, the One American News Network, they, I believe, are not on cable. Like, they're not an A1 subscription. You have to stream them off of platforms. Like, you have to stream their YouTube, you have to stream their Facebook. So these companies are publishing platforms for this news company. And what responsibility do they have? And you're exactly right. When I'm thinking of, like, what does that regulatory toolbox look like for regulating these companies? I think about, Facebook turned off Facebook essentially in Australia by the inkling threat of requiring them to pay publishers, right? They turned it off. It seems like they have been able to fix it now, but so you have that one. You have the monopoly lawsuits that are very reminiscent of the Microsoft lawsuit at the turn of the millennia, right? How do we break up these tech companies that we think are engaging in monopolistic behavior? And then I think about the Sista Fosta, which is those sex trafficking acts that were passed in Congress, that are the first amendments to Section 230 that says that these platforms and ISPs do not have any responsibility for their user-generated information, right? So, and this is, I think, ironically often cited by conservatives as like the way that they are being marginalized on social media, when it's probably actually what's protecting them the most. The only place where we have granted legal authority to do that regulation is when it's sex work, either consensual or non-consensual. Yeah, I think you're right that we are relying on these companies quite a bit to do this regulatory work of hate speech. And the thing that I kind of want to dive into is that deplatforming bit, because we saw, Jack Dorsey would have us believe that it was this magnanimous, like a bunch of tech CEOs realizing at the same time that they need to remove the former president off of their platforms, right? That they all reached the same breaking point at the same time. I'm a little bit more pessimistic, and they all saw Joe Biden just get sworn in and know that there is probably a majority in the Senate to enhance regulation on them. And they wanted to get ahead of that. But what, one, do we give up on the state regulation, right? And then two, is deplatforming our only tool in the toolbox for a solution? And I would love to, one, get Leah into this conversation on any of the things that I just said, because I went on for a bit, but also any of the other topics that have already been mentioned. So I want to go to Leah first, and then I want to dive into that deplatforming bit a little bit harder.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to touch on that second point that you made about deplatforming, and is it our only option, or do we have the capacity to make regulations, to make changes in the law, to be able to regulate this hate speech on the part of the president, on the part of our political leaders, on the part of whoever? It seems, as Kim said, and I think you said that well, Kim, you said that at this point, are we relying too heavily on these tech companies to regulate hate on their platforms instead of relying on legal frameworks and looking into them, critiquing them, and trying to change them in order to keep up with the times that we now live in? Because the law is quite antiquated when it comes to dealing with matters of speech, mostly because of the era of technology that we now live in. And so when it comes to deplatforming, it seems like our only option at the moment. But I think that if we really dive into the legal framework, if we really dive into the law and look at ways that we can change it and look at ways that we can regulate hate speech, that we can regulate in speech that incites, right? And get ahead of that, we wouldn't have to rely on these tech companies to deplatform people like the former president of the United States in order to feel like we are getting our country back under control. Excellent.
And what that made me think of, Dr. Mike Zarkin. One, do you think that the best approach regulation-wise, do we treat these social media companies like utilities, or is that in a way kind of giving up? I think we have very mixed success with utilities in this country. And is that just kind of letting Facebook become, the new power companies? Like, is that just letting Twitter become these new massive utilities?
Yeah, well, I guess if you want to solve the problem of hate speech, treating them like a common carrier or whatever wouldn't be the way to do it, right? Because then they have to serve everybody. So yeah, no, that is a good question. I don't know that I have a great answer beyond probably no, that's not the best idea. But Kim, I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, so here's the piece that we have to kind of acknowledge in this context, is that one thing we know when we try to regulate hateful speech is that those laws are almost always turned back on the people they were designed to protect. We saw this, for example, with hate speech codes on campuses in the 80s. So in the 80s, there was this movement on college campuses that said, we need to make campuses more welcoming to students who weren't normally, or hadn't been there. We have to create, we weren't using the language of a safe space, but that notion of our campuses need to be welcoming. And college campuses said, okay, we're going to put in these rules and we're going to enforce them, and we're going to make sure that our campus is free of racism and sexism and all the rest of it. And what we know about those codes is they were almost universally applied against people of color, because they and so we know that the path of regulating speech is almost always a problem, because it means that we end up with so much more of majority rules. Let's shut down the people who raise issues we don't like. And in the 30s and the 50s, it was communists. You know, and it could go in any direction. And that's the problem, is we used to define hate speech, or we used to define free speech by the notion of accommodating speech. We don't have, I mean, because here's the problem. How do you define hate speech? Because what somebody finds hateful might in fact be somebody else's political identity. And so, you know, one thing we've always struggled with in this country is how to define hate speech, which is why even the hate crimes legislation has been such a problem. Because, you know, and we talk about this, Cammie is taking my communication law class, and we talk about, you know, does it matter why somebody kills somebody if they're still dead? Does it matter if I get killed because I wear glasses, or if because of a religious identity or a gender identity, or, you know, a sexual orientation, I'm still dead? And what does it matter? And we even see this with, you know, Matthew Shepard, that the perpetrators of this act of violence have done everything to claim it wasn't hate speech. None of it matters. This was still a young man who's now dead. And so that's the problem, is when you layer it on, how do you know what's in someone's heart? Do you let them, is their denial enough? And then, you know, Leah mentioned, Australia got mentioned. Yeah, they don't have a First Amendment. And so the way that other countries talk about speech is different from the way we talk about it. Now, I'm no longer convinced that we're as right as we were, because, you know, what happened in Charlottesville, which is a direct connection to what happened in the Capitol, that hit very close to home for me. I went to college near there. I have friends who live in Charlottesville. That was something, and this is what we haven't said yet, but for me, why Charlottesville marks a change is guns. When the Nazis marched in Skokie, Illinois in the 70s, they were just idiots. Now they're idiots with guns. And for me, that changes everything. And I don't know how to talk about speech in that context of the presence of guns. And I will say that I grew up in a household where guns were not welcome. My father was a veteran, and he said, guns are not something I ever want to see again. So I grew up in a household that didn't believe in gun ownership. So I do find that threatening. I think other people probably don't as much. But now that we're intersecting speech with the ability to mass murder, I don't know what this means anymore.
Right. Do I really have the same right of you as in the public square if you have an assault rifle on your chest when you say it? And I don't think we do, to be frank. But one of the things that was making me think about actually is, you know, when these platforms removed Trump from their platforms, you know, they saw that huge decrease in hate speech. They saw that huge decrease in misinformation across the board. Mm-hmm. But so, you know, all that was happening in his comment thread, right? At what point is all of that speech, like, at what point does this kind of idiotic hate speech, when does it pass into that realm of hate speech versus just being idiot talk? And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, is we have a hard time even defining it. And when you mentioned hate crimes, I immediately went to when Utah passed their a version of a hate crimes bill a few years ago. I mean, it was exciting, but the entire time during the process, it felt nothing more to me than virtue signaling about, like, what types of people we want to say we care more about. Mm-hmm. And is that essentially what we're trying to do with hate speech? Are we saying these are the opinions that we care about? These are the identities that we accept? Because if we say we don't accept people, you know, who believe in a white ethno state, as free speech, then that's a decision that we make. Is that what we're missing from the hate speech, is being explicit of what we find? Or is hate speech often just too broad of a topic that it just applies to whoever at the moment we don't like?
Mm-hmm. Well, Mike, I think maybe, do you want to talk about the cross-burning cases, the Supreme, the difficulty we had with that, with the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think you're talking about Virginia versus Black.
Or in RAV versus St. Paul.
Yeah, well, RAV was an interesting one too, because I mean, we just had this discussion in class, but classifying hate speech, as you pointed out, under current doctrines is kind of difficult. I mean, one possibility we've looked at is we have a doctrine called fighting words, right? And that's what they tried to do in RAV. RAV, young man in St. Paul, Minnesota, ran afoul of a local statute there by burning a cross on an African-American family's home. And basically, they tried to make the case that the law, which essentially targeted, the use of certain symbols like crosses and swastikas a certain way, was, we were just regulating fighting words, which is essentially, things that are, historically not necessarily threatening, but more like insulting to people that make them want to fight. But that was like the best category, the best analogy that we had. And so that's the way they tried to deal with it there. And the court, sadly, they dealt with it horribly. They did strike down the law, but they never were able to articulate a coherent doctrine. Now, Virginia versus Black, as I recall, they came up with this other doctrine about true threats, right? That, I mean, burning a cross could be, a threat, because there's a history there. I mean, that's how it's used. But again, we don't know exactly what that's supposed to be. Is that like another category of unprotected speech? And what are the parameters? So the court, likes to create unique categories, because of course you need to separate the speech you're trying to limit from other types of speech. You don't want a chilling effect. You don't want to, and this is what, Kim was getting at. We have a hard time when we make regulations speech, we have a hard time targeting it only to the speech that we initially intended to try to regulate, right? And I feel like that's the problem. I guess my thing that has been on my mind more in some ways than hate speech, than opinions about other groups, is the lies. I mean, I think that's a whole other issue. And this, you get to the issue of what is truth, but I think that's on my mind right now is, to what extent in our political system do we have to tolerate politicians out and out lying to us, whether it's about, historically disadvantaged groups or about the election? Does that really have a place in our democracy? Well, it does, right? In the sense that we have Citizens United and we have New York Times versus Sullivan, and taken together, they effectively give you that. They give you the right to lie and spend immense amount of money lying, right? And I feel like if there isn't some way to deal with that, then we've got a real problem. And that's why the thing that I've been debating, and again, I go around in circles with this too, is the issue of civil suits. New York Times versus Sullivan said, you can't, public officials, public figures can't really sue for libel, slander, even when people lie about you. But when somebody does sue somebody with deep pockets, when somebody with deep pockets does sue one of these media outlets, we've learned, look how fast they clam up. I mean, it was just incredible, and so this is what I'm grappling with. Do we need something new? Do we need something, New York Times versus Sullivan 2.0 that says, maybe people do need to have some leeway to sue each other if that's the best idea? Because you're right, under the First Amendment, we can't go around prosecuting each other. But is civil suits, is that a different thing?
Yeah. And I mean, what I think about when it comes to like right, because there's the big lie that was told, but there was the thousands of itty bitty lies that were fed to a large swath of the country over the past like 5.5 years. And to me, one of the things that really encapsulated that was that rhetorical term that that Conway did on television, right? Where they're not lies, they're alternative facts. And that got like a lot of like meme worthiness. But like to me, it was genius. Like, of course that's what they are. Of course that's what they are. That absolves you of any wrongdoing, of any guilt, right? If this is what you believe and you're just saying it, then like that seems very squarely within your right of the way that we view as speech in this country. So with that in mind, I would love to get either Cami or Leah's thoughts on any of these topics thus far, but mostly on that truth aspect, getting more into that lying aspect, and what does the future of our country look like in free speech if it's saturated by lies?
I think that's the struggle too that so many of the social media platforms dealt with in the months leading up to the election, because they wanted to balance like that First Amendment, freedom of speech, but also what is true. And I think that's what's difficult too, because with the internet, like anybody can be a journalist these days. I mean, me covering an event on Twitter is the same as someone who's a citizen standing next to me doing the exact same thing. Anybody can put whatever they want on the internet, and it's treated the same way, regardless if it's a journalist or if it's just a citizen. So like the whole idea of like gatekeeping also is kind of out the window in that sense. And so when it comes to when Twitter started like flagging posts or taking posts down as being misleading or disputed, I thought it was like a nice gesture, but it was too little too late in my opinion, because the post is still up. No one knows like how long it took to get flagged. So people saw it and thought it was real and shared it out. And even if they took some down, there's still posts that were still up that may have not been taken. So I do think it's something that needs to start being more prioritized. I don't know what that looks like in the future. Like people are fact checking is becoming a job, and I think that's a good thing, because I think social media companies should start taking that role. But it's hard. Like part of my job at KSL is moderating comments on our Facebook posts, and there are so many people out there who really will like post comments over and over and over and over again, spewing things that aren't real just because they think it is, and they're mad at you for like perpetuating what they think is a false narrative. And it's hard to keep up with all those comments, especially in real time. And so the idea of like keeping up with truth and making sure that's the only thing that's out there, I think with social media and the internet, we might be going too far, where I'm not sure if we can actually go back to a place where only the truth is out there.
Yeah, and if I can speak to that really quickly and agree with you, Cami, I feel like we're totally past that age. When I was a kid, I remember people said, I can have my opinion. It may not be a fact, but this is how I feel and what I believe. And at this point, those feelings and those beliefs are becoming facts. Those are what people believe is the truth. No ifs, ands, or maybes, right? So there's even like bigger sections of the population that are just ready to flat out ignore a fact, an established accredited fact, and accept obvious lies willingly because it aligns with their personal beliefs. And the fact that social media companies perpetuated that and did too little too late, as you said, is just such a big problem, because this expression of what is felt truth is driving our political and social discussions instead of facts. It's emotions. We live in like this post, I don't know, like we don't believe in facts anymore. We live in a post-factual era.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, so the thing that we have kept dancing around for this past little while that I think we haven't addressed directly is the president, the former president rather. And one, so we all saw recently that he was acquitted in the Senate, even with the support of, I believe, 7 Republicans. In our undemocratic higher body, the Senate, you having a majority of the votes doesn't usually get you an affirmative outcome in a lot of cases. But I guess I would love to hear both Dr. Zarkin's views on what the former president's political future is, and what does, is that stranglehold on the Republican Party, does that stay? And then what does that mean for this larger discussion of hate speech if we can't get, this one person who was responsible for nearly 80% of the misinformation on some of these platforms fully deplatformed, right? Like even if he's not on these platforms, if he still has control over one of the 2 political parties, what does that mean for this conversation?
So I always think back. So years ago, I taught a midterm class called Media and Democracy, and that was my every summer I ran that, and we talked about all sorts of issues related to that. But when Trump announced that he was running, I was like, and we were writing the midterm schedule for the next year. I was like, I can't, I need to take a break until he goes away, which is when I started to teach my How to Be a Bitch class, which is infinitely more fun. But that notion, and I remember probably February of 2015, I said to my media law class that I didn't think Trump was actually going to even stand for the first primary because he hates to lose so much. But what I forgot, and I shouldn't have because this is what I do, is the news media loves nothing more than a shiny object. And the reality is that through 2015 and 2016, Donald Trump was the shiniest object in town. And I say this as somebody who is trained as a journalist, who loves journalists, who has very close friends who've been journalists for years. And in fact, I know people, who work in media and work in places like CNN, and they enabled it because that was their profit motive. And that's a criticism that those of us who do media, who do study the media, we've talked about this. They followed the profits, and that's why Trump got a lion's share of the coverage during the primary, despite the fact that there were more competent people, because he was entertaining. He had the best people to interview. I mean, CNN loves crazy. And I don't think anybody with CNN would deny that. Crazy makes good television. And there used to be a time when we kept crazy off television, but the problem was, and this is, Cammie mentioned gatekeepers, and here's the problem. Those gatekeepers who kept the crazy off television also kept a lot of other people off television. They kept the civil rights movement off television for a lot longer than it should have. They kept, they've silenced voices, marginalized voices, or even did violence against them. If you think about, say, the 1967 CBS documentary, The Homosexuals, which was this horrific introduction most America had to gay people. So the gatekeepers did the good thing. They shut down McCarthy eventually. They kept the really crazies off. But they weren't always good. And that's the space that media people like me live in, is that we might long for some balance, and we might long for the grownups to take over. But we also know the grownups didn't do a great job before. And this is what we have to deal with. We could, if we had gatekeepers, would they shut down things that we think are important to say? Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I would love the other Dr. Zarkin's thought about it as well. I mean, my only immediate response to that I had, like almost viscerally, when you mentioned the profit margin, I was like, oh my goodness, how haven't we discussed this already? When we kind of already got to the point when it came to well, we have to let these companies essentially do this for us. Their incentives are profit because they're companies. And we have to, I think, keep that in mind in this conversation. But more so, let's move forward. And I would love Mike's thoughts.
Well, as for the question of whether or not Trump has a political future in the Republican Party, that remains to be seen. Looking at things right now, boy, I don't see why not. That's the thing. I mean, our Senator Mitt Romney said just like yesterday, didn't he, that if the Republican primary was held today or the next few months, this year, that he'd win it hands down. He wouldn't even have any competition, right? And that's pretty frightening. I mean, we're talking about, in light of recent events, in light of the fact that there's a very real possibility that this man could go to jail for something or other, that would probably be the one major thing that could keep him from having a future of being a candidate is that he would be campaigning from jail. But he seems to have not, lost as much of his influence as you would have hoped he would, in light of everything that happened. So I don't know exactly. I think there is a very real possibility that he's going to have influence, because I think he has a support base. I think that it's very clear members of the Republican Party have signaled that they still view him as the leader of their party. And that includes people who, seemingly should know better, that and should be, working harder to think about the future beyond Trump. But I just don't know. I'm not prepared at all to write the man off. I've done that before. This goes back to what Kim was saying. I did that before, and I'm not going to do it again. I'm not going to write off the idea that he's going to try to make a comeback in 2024. If it's not him, somebody is going to, follow in his footsteps. I mean, because it seemed to work pretty well. There's got to be people out there who are saying to themselves, boy, I could do this better. He took things just a little bit too far, the whole inciting a riot thing, that, but a lot of the other stuff he did, wow, he was really successful with that. And I'm just going to give that a shot. Why not?
And
yeah. No, please.
I was going to say, to extend a frequent conversation over our dinner table, is there actually incentive for the broader elected Republicans to make a change? And right now, there's not. Whether it's gerrymandering or the fundraising issue or any of these larger questions about what in God's name has happened to Congress, that you have this imbalance, not just in representation, where you look at the 50 Democrats represent, what is it, something like 40 million more people?
46.
And you have this, I think, a political system that has been so debased to the point where, they don't have, we used to count on elections to keep people honest. And I think elections are broken, not in the way that that they're talking about at CPAC. It's not, we have all mail-in voting in Utah, and it works beautifully. And we continue to elect Republicans, despite how many, that I vote my diligent little Democratic heart out. But that, there's what's the incentive to telling the truth? You get primaried. So maybe it's the forced, is it ranked choice voting? Is, so that, we're talking about our electoral politics are broken, and that leads to Trumpism.
Right. And a quick tidbit, I don't think former President Trump would be the first person to campaign from prison. So I wouldn't count him out of that yet. But seeing how there is 7 minutes left, I did want to hold this last bit for any questions. Eileen, is there any burning questions that you or other attendees have for our distinguished panelists?
I haven't seen any question yet, but I guess I want to know from the younger folks on the panel. Do you see Trump having a future? Do you see Trump continuing, or even maybe one of his children? We're not supposed to have kings and all that stuff, but I wondered, young folks, do you think he has a future? And please post questions, folks, from the audience, and I'll read them out loud. But yeah, on the spot. Yeah, does Trump have a future for y'all?
I don't know if he specifically has a future, but I think he's kind of set a new standard for some people, because I hear people who did vote for him in both elections kind of talk to me sometimes saying, like, who's going to be the next Trump? So I think there are a lot of voters out there who are looking for, if not him to run again, a candidate who's very similar to him. So I think he's kind of set a new bar and does have, although some people don't want him to, a legacy that he's left that some candidates are going to take after. Because like Kim said, he was a shiny object and he got into the White House from like being the person who's like, I'm not like a regular politician. I think that's what a lot of people now want. And so if it's not him to run again, I think people similar to him will.
Yeah, I'd have to second that point. I feel like we're seeing in our elected representatives, and now we're seeing, well, I mean, Ted Cruz has always been there and he's horrible, but like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, I'm going to take her as an example. She is a known, right, like QAnon supporter, and she's like Trump, but like femme identifying, right? And people love her. People love her ideology, and she just mirrors Trumpism so much. And so I feel like this phenomena of Trump, I don't know if he would be president again. Not even because of the incitement, just because of like maybe the timing won't work out for him. We'd have to see down the road how politics play out. But someone like him could very well get into the White House again.
I think this might tap into Dr. Stevenson's question. How does cancel culture play into current sociopolitical context? So how does cancel culture play into current sociopolitical context, especially with the characters that you're pointing to, Leah?
Well, if we interpret cancel culture to mean accountability, which is all it really is, again, we've got to be willing to hold these people accountable. And turns out you can send a mob to kill Mike Pence, and he still talks about that Donald Trump is a close personal friend. I don't know about all y'all, but my friends don't send people to kill me. My friends don't call me names, you know, and say that I'm a coward and all that. And so, you know, it's about, we've got to be willing to vote people out. You know, Mike can speak to the incumbency reelection rate is it 98% or, you know, and so that notion, I never used to believe in term limits, for example, because I'm like, we have term limits, they're called elections. Turns out we won't use them. So maybe we need term limits because we are incapable of term limits. I think there's this an outdated perception of longevity equals power. Mike and I grew up in an era where you have these really tight controls over members of Congress, and longevity was everything. And so we keep re-electing people who, frankly, I think are probably too old. You know, I'm a die-in-the-wool Massachusetts Democrat. I wish we didn't have a 78-year-old in the White House. I'm 50. I don't think I'm that bright anymore. You know, like I kind of miss, you know, at least we used to be able to get people out with, you know, age, but we're not willing to hold anybody accountable. And so until we are, you know, we end up with insanity because, you know, do the Republicans even really want to govern, or do they just want to own the libs? Because I haven't seen a whole lot of governing happening in the last 10 years.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions, but we only have 2 minutes. Should I go ahead and read them?
Sure.
So Kim Sarkin brought up, this is from Sheridan. Kim Sarkin brought up that the media in gatekeeping, what they put onto their television could also keep important topics off of the television too. Could it become harmful if social media platforms did the same in the sense of gatekeeping what is allowed to be posted due to profit, or what might be the most popular to see?
Well, all we have to do is look at activists around breastfeeding. We all say, oh yeah, we got to keep nudity off social media. You got to keep porn off social media. And they ended up suppressing people who are activists for breastfeeding. So we know it always bites us on the butt, and it's always going to shut down marginalized voices. And that's the problem, is that's why we opt to turn for the law and we opt to allow the most amount of speech because we know what happened. And so, you know, I don't know that the question is, are we going to ever define a hard line that Trump crossed or that other politicians crossed? Or do we want to leave it up to unrepresentative companies who are controlled largely by the same people who always control things? Are we going to leave it up to them? I'm not real comfortable with that either. If I was put in charge, I think I'd do a good job. But, you know, nobody's putting me in charge.
Next question is from Dr. Matt Baker. For many students at Westminster College, this was the first election they have voted in. How does this voting experience and the transition make students feel about the future of their political involvement? Yikes.
Not great. No, just kidding. But yeah, this was my first presidential election to vote in, and it felt pretty dire. I'm not gonna lie. But I mean, as crazy and pretty stressful as Donald Trump's presidential term was, I give some credit to him because he is the reason I wanted to go into political journalism, just because I do want to keep political leaders accountable. And there's just so much going on that I was like, this shouldn't be okay. And people shouldn't just let this slide. So in some ways, I think it's helped like inspire people to want to keep people accountable. But also I think it's done a lot of damage. So it doesn't make me feel great about the future of political involvement, because as we've seen it happen in 2016, that someone like him could get elected through the harmful rhetoric that he used. I think it just opens the doors for more people to do that. But I also think it has helped more people become involved, because as we saw in this last election, like records of people have voted. So I think it's done some good, some bad. I don't feel awesome about the future, but that's okay.
I'm with Cami on this one. I think it's opened up the door to like some amazing representatives and to more young people getting involved in politics, just at the grassroots level and just like getting out to vote in the first place. We have like AOC, Ilhan Omar, like the squad in Congress now. We're seeing more diversity and more youth in our elected representatives, albeit Kim, you're completely right. Like people who should have gone a long time are still there, and they're just aging and they're not really doing anybody any good anymore. But I think I worked this past election, I worked with the Utah Democratic Party, and I was organizing in the state, and I was seeing what was happening on a national level and just trying to correlate, right? And I'm hopeful because I think we're seeing work pay off. Like we got Biden into office, right? That doesn't mean everything is solved. I think there's still a lot more work to do, and we still have to keep this administration accountable. But I don't think it's hopeless. I think we just have to avoid burnout so we can get the work done.
Awesome. Well, we are slightly past 7 now. So I think we should wrap this up, but I want to thank everyone, Kim, Mike, Eileen, Cami, Leah, for doing this, for helping out with us, and everyone who attended. This was great. I had a great time. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. And I think we could do a clap emoji. And thank you, Ryan, for moderating. That was fantastic. All right, folks, thank you so much. This will be recorded and placed somewhere. Where, I don't know. And I apologize, I couldn't put people's bios. I can't copy and paste or upload a file, so I apologize.
That's all right.
Thank you so much.
Everyone have a great night. Bye-bye.